The parking attendant helps the elderly man daily, not knowing he was scouting for his company's new CEO. This simple act of kindness, a young man named Marco offering his arm to steady an old gentleman's uncertain steps across an icy parking lot, had become their silent ritual over these past winter months. Neither spoke much beyond pleasantries, yet something profound was taking root between them, invisible as spring beneath frozen ground. Marco shivered in his thin blue uniform jacket, stamping his feet against the December cold that seemed determined to seep through his worn work boots. His breath clouded the air as he scanned the nearly empty parking garage, its concrete pillars and fluorescent lights casting long shadows across his workplace, a place that had become both his salvation and his prison. Another day, another dollar, he whispered to himself, the mantra failing to provide its usual comfort. At 28, Marco Alvarez had not imagined his life would unfold this way, directing luxury vehicles into empty spaces, validating tickets, and patrolling levels of the downtown corporate parking structure for minimum wage plus tips. The economics degree gathering dust in his apartment drawer seemed to mock him daily. 6 months ago, the regional bank that had employed him for 3 years had undergone a strategic reorganization. Corporate speak for the layoffs that had left him, and dozens of other young professionals scrambling. The parking attendant job had been meant as temporary, just something to keep the rent paid while he interviewed. But as weeks stretched into months and rejection emails accumulated in his inbox, Marco's confidence had eroded like shoreline under persistent waves. Each morning, he donned the blue uniform with a growing sense of resignation, his dreams of financial analysis and corporate strategy fading like old photographs. His phone vibrated in his pocket, another text from his mother. "Any interviews this week, mijo?" The weight of her hope was sometimes heavier than his own disappointment. He slipped the phone back without responding. What could he say? That he'd stopped applying? That he'd begun to believe this was all he deserved? The sound of an approaching vehicle drew his attention. Marco straightened his posture and adjusted his cap. Small dignities he still clung to. Through the morning mist, he recognized the sleek black Lexus that arrived each day precisely at 8:15 a.m. The car eased to a stop before him, its engine purring with quiet luxury. The door opened, and as it had every weekday for nearly 3 months, Marco's routine shifted from mundane to meaningful. "Good morning, Mr. Gardner," he called, already moving to help. The elderly man emerged slowly from the driver's seat, one hand gripping the door frame, while the other clutched a polished wooden cane. Alexander Gardner, his name learned only through the premium parking pass displayed on his dashboard, nodded in acknowledgement, his lined face creasing into what might have been a smile. "Morning, young man. Cold one today." "Yes, sir. Ice everywhere. Please, let me help you." Marco offered his arm, as he had since that first October morning when he'd noticed the old man's unsteady gait. Mr. Gardner hesitated, pride briefly flashing across his weathered features before necessity won out. He placed a gloved hand on Marco's forearm, his grip surprisingly firm for a man who appeared to be in his late 70s. Together they navigated the treacherous 20 yards from parking spot to elevator, a journey that would take a younger person mere seconds, but required careful attention for the elderly gentleman. Marco matched his pace to the slow, deliberate steps, feeling the slight tremors that occasionally ran through the old man's frame. "Did you see the financial report this morning?" Mr. Gardner asked, his breath forming small clouds between them. Marco felt the familiar sting of his abandoned career. "No, sir. I haven't been following the markets much lately." The old man responded, neither judging nor dismissing. Sometimes stepping back gives better perspective. They reached the elevator and Marco pressed the button, watching the numbers illuminate above the doors. In these brief moments together, he often found himself wondering about Alexander Gardner's story. The man's tailored overcoat and custom-made shoes spoke of wealth, while his eyes, clear blue and surprisingly sharp, suggested an intelligence undiminished by age. Yet there was something else there too, a solitude that resonated with Marco's own. "Will you be leaving at the usual time today, Mr. Gardner?" "Round 4. "Yes, I expect so." The older man nodded, adjusting his grip on the ornate cane. "Unless these meetings run long, everyone talks so much these days, don't they? Words, 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 but so little said." The elevator arrived with a soft chime. Mr. Gardner stepped inside, turning to face Marco. "Thank you, as always." "Of course, sir. Have a good day." As the doors closed between them, Marco never imagined that Alexander Gardner, the seemingly ordinary elderly man he assisted each morning, was the founder and chairman of Gardner Financial Group, a corporate empire with assets exceeding $11 billion. Nor could he have guessed that their brief interactions were being weighed and measured with the careful deliberation of a man who had spent 50 years judging character as carefully as investment potential. Alexander Gardner leaned heavily on his cane as the elevator ascended to the 40th floor. The pain in his hip, a constant companion since his fall last summer, flared with each heartbeat. His doctors had advised against driving, had suggested a car service or perhaps finally accepting retirement at 78. But Alexander had built his empire by trusting his instincts and maintaining control. Two principles that didn't align with being chauffeured about like an invalid. Besides, if he'd followed their advice, he would never have met the young man downstairs. Marco, according to his name tag. Alexander had been observing him for 97 days now, noting the consistent courtesy that never felt forced, the intelligence that occasionally slipped through casual conversation, and most importantly, the innate decency that couldn't be faked over repeated interactions. The elevator doors opened to reveal his executive assistant, Diane, waiting with her tablet in a concerned expression. "The board members are already in the conference room," she said, falling into step beside him. "They're not happy about the agenda." Alexander grunted. "They're never happy unless quarterly profits increase by double digits. They'll be considerably less happy when I tell them I've found my replacement." Diane nearly stumbled. "You've decided?" "Who?" "Not Prescott." "No," Alexander said, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Someone they've never met, someone who doesn't even know he's being considered." "Mr. Gardner, the board will do as I recommend, as they have for 5 decades. He interrupted, his voice gentle but brooking no argument. "This company was built on seeing value where others don't look, on recognizing character as the foundation of leadership." He paused outside the conference room doors. "I'm not dead yet, Diane. And before I go, I intend to ensure that what I've built doesn't become just another soulless corporation." Inside the conference room, 12 men and women in expensive suits rose as he entered. Alexander noted the thinly veiled impatience in some faces, the calculated deference in others. The Gardner Financial Group Board of Directors, brilliant financial minds certainly, but most lacking the one quality he valued above all: humanity. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, lowering himself carefully into the chair at the head of the table. "Thank you for coming. Today we begin discussing the future of this company." Meanwhile, 40 floors below, Marco continued his workday, unaware that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't imagine. The parking garage filled with the usual morning rush, executives and administrative staff hurrying to elevators, barely glancing his way. He directed traffic, validated tickets, and helped an elderly woman find her misplaced vehicle, all while trying to ignore the gnawing emptiness that had become his constant companion. During his lunch break, Marco sat alone in the attendance booth, scrolling through job listings on his phone more out of habit than hope. His economics degree and 3 years of entry-level banking experience seemed woefully inadequate in a job market flooded with candidates possessing MBAs and prestigious internships. A notification appeared, another rejection email from a position he'd applied for weeks ago. Marco closed the browser and instead opened his bank app, wincing at the balance. Rent was due in 10 days, and even with careful budgeting, he would barely make it. His phone rang, his sister Elena this time. "Hey," he answered, trying to inject cheerfulness into his voice. "Hey yourself," she replied, the background noise suggesting she was at the hospital where she worked as a nurse. "Mom's worried about you. Said you haven't been returning her texts." Marco sighed. "I'm fine, just busy." "Busy parking cars?" The question held no judgment, only concern. "It's a job, Elena. It pays bills." I know. But Marco, you can't just give up. That's not you." He wanted to tell her that maybe she didn't know who he was anymore, that sometimes he wasn't sure himself. Instead, he said, "I have to get back to work. I'll call Mom tonight, I promise." After hanging up, Marco stepped outside the booth, needing air that didn't feel confined by low ceilings and limited prospects. The winter sun offered light without warmth, illuminating the city skyline that surrounded the parking structure. Somewhere in those gleaming towers, decisions were being made. Fortunes created or lost, careers advanced or ended, a world that seemed increasingly distant from his own. "You look troubled, young man." Marco turned to find Mr. Gardner standing a few feet away, leaning on his cane. He hadn't heard the elevator arrive. "Mr. Gardner, I didn't expect to see you until later. Is everything all right?" The old man's eyes, startlingly alert in his lined face, studied Marco with unexpected intensity. "Just needed some fresh air. These boardrooms become stuffy with importance." He gestured to the space beside him. Walk with me? Surprised, Marco nodded, falling into step beside the elderly gentleman as they moved slowly along the perimeter of the parking level. For several minutes, they walked in silence, their footsteps echoing against concrete. "Tell me," Mr. Gardner finally said, "what brought you to this parking garage?" The question, asked without preamble or context, caught Marco off guard. He almost gave his standard response, that he was between opportunities, that this was temporary, but something in the old man's direct gaze invited honesty. "Life, I guess," he answered with a small shrug. "I used to work at Meridian Bank in their analytics department. When they downsized, I was let go. Been applying elsewhere for months, but..." He trailed off, embarrassed by the admission of failure. "And before Meridian? Education?" "Economics, University of Washington. Class of 2017. Mr. Gardner nodded as if confirming something to himself. "And if you could be doing anything now, what would it be?" Marco looked out at the city spread before them, the question stirring ambitions he'd been trying to suppress. "I'd be helping build something meaningful. At Meridian, I was just analyzing data sets, but I could see patterns, opportunities. I wanted to move into strategic planning, help small businesses grow." He stopped, suddenly self-conscious. "Sorry, you didn't ask for my life story." "On the contrary," the old man replied, "I find it quite relevant." He paused, looking out at the same view. "Do you know what I see when I look at this city, Marco?" The use of his first name was unexpected. "No, sir. I see millions of interconnected lives. Decisions made in one building affecting livelihoods in another. Money flowing like blood through veins, nourishing or depriving based on choices made by people who often forget there are human beings on the receiving end." He turned to face Marco. "In my experience, the best business leaders never forget that fundamental truth." Before Marco could respond, Mr. Gardner's phone buzzed. He checked it inside. "Duty calls. The wolves are getting restless." He began moving toward the elevator, then stopped. "Would you assist me again?" "Of course." As they walked back, Mr. Gardner asked, "Do you have plans this Sunday, Marco?" The question was so unexpected that Marco stumbled slightly. "Sunday? No, I'm off work." "Yummerson, good. I'd like you to join me for lunch. There's a matter I'd like to discuss with you." The old man reached into his coat and produced a business card, holding it out. "My address. 1 o'clock?" Marco took the card automatically, glancing down at the embossed lettering. Alexander Gardner, founder and chairman, Gardner Financial Group. His head snapped up in shock. But Mr. Gardner, Alexander Gardner, one of the wealthiest men in the state, merely smiled at his expression. "Sometimes, Marco, life parks us exactly where we need to be, even when we think we've taken a wrong turn. Sunday, 1 o'clock. Don't dress up, I see enough suits during the week." With that cryptic statement, he entered the elevator, leaving Marco standing bewildered, the business card heavy in his hand like a key to a door he hadn't known existed. The rest of Marco's workday passed in a blur of confusion and speculation. He had searched Alexander Gardner's name during his afternoon break, finding countless articles about the financial visionary who had built a small investment firm into a multi-billion-dollar enterprise over 5 decades. Pictures showed a younger version of the man he'd been helping each morning, the same piercing blue eyes but with dark hair instead of white, standing alongside presidents and global business leaders. By the time Marco returned to his small apartment that evening, his mind was racing with questions. Why would someone like Alexander Gardner take any interest in a parking attendant? Was the lunch invitation genuine, or had he somehow misunderstood? And what matter could possibly require discussion between them? He called his mother as promised, carefully avoiding any mention of the day's unexpected development. She would read too much into it, build hopes that would likely end in disappointment. Instead, he assured her he was fine, promised to visit soon, and tried to ignore the worry in her voice. After hanging up, Marco sat on his worn sofa, the business card on the coffee table before him. Its elegant simplicity, cream-colored stock, black embossed lettering, a subtle emblem in the corner, spoke of quiet wealth and power. He tried to imagine himself driving to that address on Sunday, sitting across from Alexander Gardner at lunch, and failed. Their worlds were too different, separated by fortune and circumstance. Yet something about the old man's words kept returning to him. Life parks us exactly where we need to be. Was it possible that his series of setbacks, the layoff, the rejections, the parking attendant job, had been leading him toward some unforeseen opportunity? Marco shook his head, unwilling to indulge such fanciful thinking. More likely, Gardner wanted to offer him some minor position out of pity, a janitor at headquarters perhaps, or a mailroom clerk. Still, even that would be a step up from the parking garage. Sunday arrived crisp and clear, winter sunlight gleaming off fresh snow that had fallen overnight. Marco stood before his closet, wrestling with Gardner's instruction not to dress up. Finally, he settled on dark jeans, a blue button-down shirt, and the only sport coat he owned, casual enough to honor the request, but presentable enough to show respect. The address led him to the affluent neighborhood of Madison Park, where elegant homes overlooked Lake Washington. Gardner's residence proved to be a stately craftsman house, substantial without being ostentatious, set back from the street behind mature maple trees. As Marco approached the front door, doubt nearly overwhelmed him. He checked the address again, confirmed it matched the card, and finally gathered the courage to ring the bell. The door opened to reveal not a butler or housekeeper as he'd half expected, but Alexander Gardner himself, dressed in slacks and a cardigan, looking more like a retired professor than a business tycoon. Right on time, Gardner nodded approvingly. "Come in, Marco. Welcome to my home." The interior was warm and inviting. Hardwood floors, built-in bookshelves laden with volumes, comfortable furniture that invited use rather than admiration. Family photographs lined the walls showing Gardner through the decades with what appeared to be children and grandchildren. "Your family?" Marco asked, gesturing to the photos. A shadow passed over Gardner's face. "Yes, my late wife Catherine, our daughter Elizabeth, and her children." He moved toward a doorway. "This way. I hope you're hungry. My housekeeper left us quite a spread before she departed for her weekend." In the dining room, a table was set for two, laden with a simple but elegant lunch. Soup, artisan bread, a cheese board, and a bottle of wine already open to breathe. As they sat, Marco noticed that Gardner moved more stiffly than usual, wincing slightly as he lowered himself into his chair. "Are you all right, sir?" Gardner waved away the concern. "Old age, nothing more. Though my doctors disagree. They're rather insistent that I use a wheelchair, at least temporarily." He poured wine for them both. "I've been equally insistent about maintaining my independence. Hence our meeting here rather than at a restaurant. Fewer witnesses to my occasional grimaces." Marco smiled despite his nervousness. There was something disarming about the old man's candor. "I imagine you're curious why I invited you." Gardner continued, passing a basket of bread. "Very much so, sir. Alexander, please. Or Alex, if you prefer. Sir makes me feel even older than I am." He took a sip of wine, studying Marco over the rim of his glass. "Tell me, what do you know about Gardner Financial Group?" Marco recalled what he'd read online. Founded in 1973, started as an investment advisory firm, expanded into commercial banking, wealth management, and venture capital. Currently manages around $11 billion in assets. Gardner nodded. "A reasonable summary. What's less widely known is that I'm stepping down at the end of this fiscal year." "Retiring?" Marco asked, surprised that such news hadn't been public. "Transitioning," Gardner corrected. "The board knows, but we haven't made a public announcement yet. First, we need to identify my successor." He paused, his gaze direct and unwavering. "That's where you come in." Marco nearly choked on his bread. "I what?" "I don't understand. For the past 3 months, I've been conducting what you might call an unconventional search. My board wanted to promote from within, specifically our current CFO, Prescott Reynolds. Brilliant with numbers, Prescott. Less brilliant with people." Gardner leaned forward. "I built my company on a principle that seems increasingly rare in modern business. That financial success should serve human needs, not the reverse." He rose slowly, retrieving a folder from a sideboard. "I've been looking for someone who embodies that principle. Someone with financial acumen, certainly, but more importantly, with character and compassion. So I've been arriving at our headquarters building early each day, observing how people behave when they don't think they're being watched." Marco set down his spoon, realization dawning. "You've been evaluating me all this time?" "Among others initially, but you quickly became the most interesting candidate." Gardner opened the folder, revealing what appeared to be detailed notes. 97 days of observation. You've never been late. You treat everyone with the same respect, regardless of the car they drive or the suit they wear. You've helped elderly visitors, retrieved dropped items for people too busy to thank you. And once I observed you pay for a young woman's parking when her credit card was declined. Despite the fact that I suspect you can ill afford such generosity. Marco felt heat rise to his face, uncomfortable with this revelation. "Mr. Gardner, Alexander, I appreciate the observation, but I'm just a parking attendant. I have no experience running a company, let alone one worth billions." Gardner closed the folder. "When I started, I had no experience either. I had intelligence, work ethic, and a moral compass. The rest I learned." He sipped his wine thoughtfully. Besides, I'm not proposing to install you as CEO tomorrow. What I'm offering is a pathway, starting as my special assistant, learning the business from the inside, with personal mentorship from me. Marco's mind reeled with the implications. Why me? Surely there are thousands of MBAs who would be better qualified. I don't need another MBA who can calculate net present value. Gardner interrupted, a hint of impatience creeping into his voice. I need someone who understands that every number on a balance sheet represents real people with real lives. Someone who sees beyond quarterly earnings to the human impact of business decisions. His expression softened. Someone like you, Marco. The silence that followed was heavy with possibility. Marco stared at his soup, no longer hungry, his thoughts churning. This seems impossible. Most worthwhile things do at first. Gardner's eyes crinkled with gentle humor. Consider your current position. Did you imagine 6 months ago that you'd be parking cars for a living? No, Marco admitted. Life rarely follows our expectations. The question is whether we have the courage to recognize opportunity when it arrives in unexpected forms. Gardner reached across the table, his hand steady despite his age. I'm 78 years old, Marco. I don't have time for conventional approaches. I need to know my life's work will be in good hands. The weight of those words settled over Marco. This wasn't merely a job offer. It was a legacy being offered to him, a stranger who had simply shown kindness without expectation of reward. What would this involve exactly? He asked finally. Gardner's face brightened. A 2-year apprenticeship, essentially. Working directly with me, learning every aspect of the business. If at the end of that time we both feel it's the right fit, you would be formally announced as my chosen successor. The board would have input, of course, but my voting shares give me considerable influence in the final decision. He named a starting salary that made Marco's eyes widen, more than 5 times what he currently earned. Think about it. Gardner continued. Take a few days if you need to, but know that I wouldn't make this offer if I weren't confident in your potential. Later, as Marco drove home through streets transformed by evening shadows, his mind replayed the conversation. The offer seemed too fantastical to be real. The stuff of movies, not actual life. Yet the business card in his pocket and the wine still warming his veins confirmed the reality of the lunch. His phone rang, the car's Bluetooth displaying his sister's name. Hey, Elena. Hey, yourself. How was your mysterious lunch? You never said who it was with. Marco hesitated, then decided truth was simpler than evasion. Alexander Gardner. The Alexander Gardner. The silence that followed was so prolonged, he thought the call had dropped. Elena? You had lunch with the founder of Gardner Financial? The billionaire? Why? He offered me a job. Another silence. What kind of job? His special assistant. With the possibility of more. Marco couldn't bring himself to say the rest. It sounded too preposterous spoken aloud. Marco, how did this happen? He explained about the parking garage, the daily assistance, Gardner's unconventional talent search. As he spoke, the situation's improbability struck him anew. Sounds crazy, right? Like some kind of elaborate prank. It sounds like someone saw your worth. Elena replied softly, something the rest of us have known all along. Her words loosened something in his chest, a knot of self-doubt that had been tightening for months. You think I should take it? I think opportunities like this don't come along often. And I think you deserve it. She paused. Mom's going to lose her mind when you tell her. Marco laughed, the sound surprising him with its genuineness. One step at a time. After saying goodbye, he drove the remaining distance to his apartment in contemplative silence. The decision before him wasn't just about a job. It was about faith. In himself, in Gardner's judgment, in the possibility that his life could change course so dramatically from a simple act of daily kindness. At home, Marco found himself standing before the bathroom mirror, studying his reflection as if searching for whatever quality Gardner had seen in him. The face that looked back appeared unchanged. The same dark eyes, the same features that had gazed back at him during months of growing despair. Yet something had shifted internally, a rekindling of hope he'd nearly forgotten. He slept fitfully that night, dreams filled with boardrooms and balance sheets, interspersed with images of Gardner's penetrating blue eyes. By morning, his decision was made, not through logical analysis, but through a deep, intuitive certainty that had settled in his bones. Monday dawned clear and cold. Marco reported to his shift at the parking garage as usual, but with resignation letter in hand. His supervisor seemed unsurprised, even congratulating him with genuine warmth. Never thought you belonged here anyway, Alvarez. Too smart by half. At precisely 8:15 a.m., the familiar black Lexus pulled into the garage. Marco straightened his uniform one last time and walked forward to meet it. Gardner emerged, cane in hand, his expression brightening at the sight of Marco. "Hey, good morning." "Good morning, Alexander." The use of the first name felt strange but right. "I've made my decision." The old man's eyebrows rose. "That was quick. Some opportunities don't need much deliberation." Marco offered his arm as always, steadying Gardner as they began their walk toward the elevator. "I accept your offer, with gratitude and, I hope, the humility to recognize how much I have to learn." Gardner's face broke into a genuine smile, years seeming to fall away from his features. "Excellent. When can you start?" "I've given my notice. 2 weeks. Make it 1. I'll have HR prepare everything." They reached the elevator, but instead of saying goodbye as usual, Gardner held the door. "Come up with me. Time you saw where you'll be working." Marco hesitated, glancing down at his parking attendant uniform. Gardner chuckled. "Appearances matter far less than most people think." "Coming?" With a deep breath, Marco stepped into the elevator. As the doors closed and they began their ascent, he felt a symbolic threshold being crossed. From one life into another, from resignation to possibility. "Nervous?" Gardner asked, noting Marco's tense posture. "Terrified," Marco admitted with a small laugh. "Good. Yeah, good. Fear keeps us honest. Keeps us humble." The old man's eyes twinkled. "Just remember, everyone up there puts their pants on one leg at a time, regardless of how expensive those pants might be." The elevator climbed smoothly, numbers illuminating as they passed each floor. When they reached 40, the doors opened to reveal a reception area of understated elegance. Marble floors, wood paneling, and a discreet logo behind a modern desk where a receptionist looked up in surprise. "Mr. Gardner, we weren't expecting you so early." "Change of plans, Jennifer. This is Marco Alvarez, my new special assistant. He'll be starting next Monday." Gardner's tone made the introduction sound entirely normal, as if he regularly brought parking attendants to the executive floor. "Is the conference room available? I'd like to give him a tour. Then we have some matters to discuss." The receptionist's professional smile remained fixed, though her eyes betrayed momentary confusion. "Of course, sir. Oui, sir. The morning briefing isn't until 9:30. Gardner nodded and gestured for Marco to follow him down a corridor, lined with photographs depicting the company's history. "First lesson," he murmured as they walked. "Confidence is contagious. If you act as though you belong, others will rarely question your presence." The next hour passed in a whirlwind as Gardner showed Marco the executive floor, introducing him to early arriving staff with the same matter-of-fact tone. Some responded with obvious curiosity, others with barely concealed skepticism, but all were unfailingly polite to the man their chairman presented as his new assistant. They ended in Gardner's corner office, a spacious room with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city, and in the distance the snow-capped Cascade Mountains. Unlike the modernist aesthetic of the rest of the floor, Gardner's personal space felt more like a comfortable study, with leather chairs, bookshelves, and framed family photographs. "Sit," Gardner instructed, gesturing to one of the chairs as he lowered himself into another. "Hatanada Shantuis." "How does it feel?" Marco looked around, still processing the morning's events. "Overwhelming. Unreal. It will become real quickly enough." Gardner's expression grew serious. "There will be resistance, Marco. Prescott and his allies on the board won't welcome you. Some will try to undermine you, test you, provoke you into mistakes. Why tell me this now? Because forewarned is forearmed." The old man leaned forward. "You'll need allies. Diane, my executive assistant, she's loyal and brilliant. The head of our community investment division, James Chen, he understands the company's soul. And my granddaughter, Rebecca, who runs our foundation, she has excellent judgment about people." Marco nodded, trying to commit the names to memory. "What about you? How involved will you be?" "Completely at first, then gradually less so. You need to establish your own identity, your own leadership style. I'll guide, not dictate." Gardner smiled slightly. "Though I reserve the right to occasionally meddle." A knock at the door interrupted them. A woman in her 50s entered, carrying a tablet and wearing an expression of barely contained urgency. "Alexander, the Tokyo team is on the line. They need a decision on the Nakamura acquisition before their market opens." She glanced at Marco with open curiosity. "Diane, meet Marco Alvarez." "Marco, this is Diane Miller, without whom this entire company would collapse in approximately 17 minutes. Diane's professional demeanor cracked slightly as she offered her hand to Marco. Mr. Alvarez, Alexander mentioned you. Welcome to the chaos. Thank you, Marco replied, trying to project a confidence he didn't yet feel. Gardner rose, wincing slightly. Duty calls. Marco, can you find your way back to the parking garage? Return here Monday morning, 8 a.m. sharp. Diane will help you with the paperwork, security access, all that. Yes, sir, Alexander. Marco stood, suddenly uncertain about the protocol for departing. Gardner solved the dilemma by extending his hand. As Marco took it, the old man held on for a moment longer than necessary. Remember why I chose you, Marco? Not for your financial expertise, that can be taught, but for what's in here. He tapped Marco's chest lightly. That's much rarer and far more valuable. With those words, Marco was ushered out, left to navigate his way back to the parking garage and the last week of his old life. As he rode the elevator down, his uniform suddenly felt like a costume, something he was wearing temporarily rather than an identity he'd reluctantly accepted. The following days passed in a blur of preparations. Marco gave notice at his apartment, finding a more suitable place closer to headquarters. He called his mother and sister, sharing the news with a mixture of excitement and disbelief. His mother wept, murmuring prayers of gratitude, while Elena simply said, "I told you so," her voice thick with emotion. He purchased new clothes, guided by Elena's practical advice, rather than trying to mimic the expensive suits he'd observed in the executive suite. Be professional but authentic, she counseled. Gardner chose you, not some polished corporate clone. On his last day at the parking garage, Marco arrived early, determined to fulfill his duties with the same care he always had. When Gardner's Lexus appeared at 8:15, Marco felt an unexpected pang of nostalgia. This daily ritual, helping the elderly man from his car to the elevator, had become meaningful to him, and now it was ending. Gardner seemed to sense his mood. Having second thoughts? He asked as Marco offered his arm. Number 1. Just appreciating the journey. The old man nodded approvingly. Good answer. The past shapes us, but we mustn't let it define us. Monday, you'll step into a new future, one with greater challenges but also greater possibilities. I'll be ready. Gardner studied him, then patted his arm. Yes, I believe you will. As they reached the elevator, Marco fought the impulse to accompany Gardner upstairs. This threshold would be crossed properly on Monday. Instead, he simply said, "Until Monday then." Until Monday. Gardner entered the elevator, then held the door a moment longer. Oh, and Marco, get a good night's sleep Sunday. Your first week will be eventful. The doors closed before Marco could ask what he meant. Monday morning arrived with a crystalline clarity that seemed fitting for new beginnings. Marco dressed carefully in his new attire, charcoal slacks, light blue shirt, navy blazer, professional without pretension. The face in the mirror looked both familiar and strange, poised between past and future. He arrived at Gardner Financial headquarters at 7:45 a.m., no longer entering through the parking garage, but through the main lobby with its soaring atrium and security checkpoints. The guard checked his ID against a list, then directed him to the executive floor. Diane met him at the elevator, her efficient manner softened by a genuine smile. Right on time. Good. Alexander values punctuality. She handed him a security badge and a sleek company phone. These are temporary. IT will set you up properly later today. First, we need to get through HR paperwork. Then Alexander wants to see you. The morning passed in a whirlwind of forms, introductions, and systems orientation. By noon, Marco's head was swimming with new information, names, and protocols. Throughout it all, he was acutely aware of the curious glances from employees who clearly wondered how a young, unknown outsider had suddenly appeared in the chairman's orbit. After a quick lunch at his new desk, a workspace in an antechamber outside Gardner's office, Diane informed him that the chairman was ready to see him. Fair warning, she added with a grimace. Prescott Reynolds is in there too. Marco straightened his tie, took a deep breath, and entered. Gardner sat behind his desk, while another man, tall, silver-haired, immaculately dressed, stood by the window, his posture radiating tension. Both turned as Marco entered. Ah, Marco, right on time. Gardner gestured to the other man. Meet Prescott Reynolds, our CFO. Prescott, this is Marco Alvarez, my new special assistant. Reynolds extended his hand, his grip firm to the point of discomfort. Mr. Alvarez, Alexander has told us remarkably little about you. His smile didn't reach his eyes. What firm were you with previously? Before Marco could answer, Gardner intervened. Marco comes to us with a fresh perspective, Prescott. Economics degree from University of Washington, experience in banking analytics. At Meridian Bank, wasn't it? Reynolds' tone suggested he'd already investigated Marco's background. Junior analyst, if I recall, before their restructuring. Marco met the man's gaze directly. That's correct. Fascinating career trajectory. From junior analyst to parking attendant to... Reynolds glanced at Gardner. Special assistant to the chairman. Quite the meteoric rise. The implied criticism was clear, but Marco refused to be baited. I believe in making the most of opportunities, Mr. Reynolds. And in proving my worth through actions rather than credentials? Gardner's eyes crinkled with suppressed amusement. Well said. Now shall we discuss the Seattle Community Trust proposal? Marco, I'd like your perspective after we review the details. For the next hour, Gardner led them through a complex community investment initiative, occasionally asking Marco for his input. Though initially hesitant, Marco found himself drawing on his analytical background to raise questions about risk assessment and sustainability that seemed to impress Gardner, if not Reynolds. When the meeting concluded, Reynolds departed with a cold nod, leaving Marco alone with Gardner. That went well, the old man said, leaning back in his chair. Marco raised an eyebrow. Did it? I'm pretty sure Mr. Reynolds is already planning my professional funeral. Gardner laughed. Undoubtedly. Prescott expected to be sitting in this chair after my retirement. Now he sees you as a threat despite your lack of experience. He studied Marco thoughtfully. How did it feel? Being challenged like that? Uncomfortable, Marco admitted. But necessary, I suppose. I'll need to earn respect here. Yes, you will. And it won't come easily. Gardner rose, moving to a credenza where a coffee service was arranged. There's something I haven't told you yet. Something that will make your position here even more complicated. Marco tensed. What is it? Gardner poured 2 cups, handing one to Marco before resuming his seat. My health. The cane. The occasional pain you've observed. It's more serious than I've let on. Parkinson's, early stages, combined with complications from a fall last year. The prognosis is uncertain. The revelation landed heavily. I'm sorry. Don't be. I've lived a full life. Gardner sipped his coffee. But it does accelerate our timeline. The board knows about my condition, which is partly why they're anxious about succession. What they don't know is how quickly I may need to step back. How quickly? Months, possibly. Not years. Gardner's gaze was steady, which means your apprenticeship will be intensive and compressed. You'll need to absorb in months what I'd hoped to teach you over years. Marco set down his cup, the weight of the situation finally hitting him. Alexander, are you sure about this? About me? The stakes seem higher than you realized? Gardner finished for him. They are, but my decision remains the same. You have the character and intelligence this company needs in its next leader. The rest can be learned. He leaned forward intently. The question is, now that you understand the full scope of the challenge, are you still willing to accept it? The question hung in the air between them. Marco thought of his months of unemployment, the rejections, the diminishing hope. He thought of his family's pride when he told them about this opportunity. And he thought of Gardner, this remarkable man who had seen something in him worth believing in. Yes, he said finally, his voice steady despite the doubts swirling within. I'm still in. Gardner's face relaxed into a smile. Good. Then we begin in earnest. He pressed a button on his desk. Diane, please bring in the Nakamura files and schedule the senior leadership meeting for tomorrow morning. It's time to introduce Marco properly to the team. The weeks that followed were the most demanding of Marco's life. Each day began before dawn and often ended well after midnight. His mind constantly stretched to absorb new information, understand complex financial structures, and navigate the intricate politics of corporate leadership. Gardner proved to be both a demanding mentor and a steadfast advocate. He thrust Marco into challenging situations, client meetings, strategy sessions, board presentations, sometimes with preparation, sometimes with none at all. Real leadership isn't demonstrated in controlled environments, he explained after one particularly grueling negotiation. It emerges under pressure when plans fall apart. Some executives embrace Marco's presence, particularly James Chen, the community investment director Gardner had mentioned, who became both ally and friend. Others, led by Prescott Reynolds, maintained a cool professional distance laced with skepticism. The divide created an undercurrent of tension that Marco could feel whenever he entered a meeting room. Through it all, Gardner's health became an increasing concern. Some days his hands trembled so badly he could barely sign documents. Other days, pain etched lines around his eyes as he struggled to maintain his grueling schedule. Yet he refused to publicly acknowledge any weakness, pushing himself with the same determination he demanded from Marco. 2 months into this new life, Marco arrived at the office early one morning to find Rebecca Gardner, Alexander's granddaughter, whom he'd met briefly but hadn't worked with directly, waiting outside his office. In her mid-30s, with her grandfather's piercing blue eyes and an air of confident composure, Rebecca ran the Gardner Foundation, the philanthropic arm of the company. She rose as Marco approached. "We need to talk," she said without preamble. "About my grandfather." Marco unlocked his office, gesturing for her to enter. "Is he all right?" "No," she replied bluntly, closing the door behind them. "He collapsed at home last night. He's stable, but the doctors are insistent this time. He needs to reduce his workload immediately." Marco sank into his chair, concern for Gardner overwhelming any worry about professional implications. "Why didn't anyone call me?" "He asked us not to." Rebecca's expression softened slightly. "He's rather stubborn about appearing vulnerable, especially to you." "To me? Why?" "Because he believes in you, Marco. More than you probably realize." She crossed her arms, studying him with an intensity reminiscent of her grandfather. "He's been pushing himself beyond reasonable limits to prepare you, and now we're out of time. The board is meeting this afternoon to discuss interim leadership arrangements." Marco felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. "They'll choose Reynolds." "Probably. Unless ... She hesitated. "Unless you can convince them otherwise." "Me? I've been here 2 months. I have no standing with the board. You have my grandfather's confidence. And you have more allies than you think." Rebecca leaned forward. "The meeting is at 2. My grandfather intended to be there to support you, but that's impossible now. So the question is, are you ready to stand on your own?" The hours before the board meeting passed in a blur of preparation. Marco reviewed financial reports, strategy documents, and project statuses, trying to anticipate every possible question. Rebecca arranged for him to visit Gardner briefly in the hospital, where the old man, despite looking frail against white sheets, remained characteristically direct. "This isn't how I planned it," Gardner said, his voice weaker but his eyes sharp as ever. "But perhaps it's better this way. No safety net. Sink or swim." "I'm not sure the board will even let me in the water," Marco admitted. Gardner's laugh turned into a cough. When he recovered, he fixed Marco with an intent gaze. "They'll listen because I've instructed them to. What happens after that depends on you." He reached for Marco's hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "Remember why I chose you. Not for what you know, but for who you are." At 2 o'clock, Marco entered the boardroom, heart pounding but outwardly composed. 12 pairs of eyes turned to him, some curious, some hostile, some unreadable. At the head of the table sat Prescott Reynolds, already positioned in what he clearly considered his rightful place. "Mr. Alvarez," Reynolds began, his tone suggesting Marco was an unexpected interruption. "We're about to begin a private board discussion. Perhaps Diane misunderstood." "She didn't," Marco interrupted calmly. "Alexander asked me to represent his interests today." He remained standing, making eye contact with each board member in turn. "Before you make decisions about interim leadership, I believe he would want you to hear an alternative perspective." Reynolds' jaw tightened, but Rebecca, seated midway down the table, nodded encouragingly. "I think we should hear what Marco has to say." For the next 30 minutes, Marco presented a vision for the company's future that balanced financial growth with social responsibility. A vision informed by countless conversations with Gardner, but shaped by Marco's own experiences and values. He acknowledged his limited tenure, but emphasized his intensive immersion in all aspects of the business under Gardner's direct mentorship. Alexander Gardner built this company on the principle that profit and purpose can coexist. Marco concluded, "That financial success is meaningful only when it contributes to human flourishing. As you consider interim leadership, I ask you to remember that legacy and to consider who will truly honor it." Silence followed his words. Then Reynolds spoke, his tone measured but cold. "A stirring speech, Mr. Alvarez, but running a multi-billion-dollar financial institution requires more than inspirational platitudes. It requires experience, expertise, and the confidence of the market." He gestured to the board. "How would you explain to our shareholders that we've entrusted their investments to a former parking attendant with 2 months of executive experience?" The question was designed to humiliate, to remind everyone of Marco's humble recent past. But instead of shame, Marco felt a sudden clarity, a recognition that his background, far from being a liability, was perhaps his greatest strength. "I would tell them," he replied steadily, "that Gardner Financial is being led by someone who understands both sides of the economic divide, someone who has experienced financial hardship firsthand and knows what it means when institutions either uplift or abandon those they serve. His voice gained strength. I would tell them their investments are being guided by principles that have built this company's success for 5 decades. Principles that balance profit with purpose, returns with responsibility. He turned to face Reynolds directly. And I would remind them that Alexander Gardner himself began not in a boardroom, but in a small storefront office, with nothing but intelligence, integrity, and a vision for what finance could be at its best. The room fell silent again, but the quality of the silence had changed. Marco could feel the shift. Not unanimous support, certainly, but a willingness to consider possibilities beyond the obvious succession. Rebecca was the first to speak. I move that we establish a 3-month interim leadership structure, with Marco and Prescott serving as co-executives, reporting directly to the board. After 3 months, we reassess based on performance. The proposal sparked intense discussion, with Reynolds arguing forcefully against what he termed an unprecedented and risky arrangement. But other board members, particularly those with longest tenure, seemed intrigued by the possibility of honoring Gardner's wishes while mitigating risk. In the end, the motion passed narrowly, 7 votes to 5, with Rebecca's compromise accepted as a temporary solution. Marco would oversee client relationships, community investment, and the foundation. Reynolds would manage finance, operations, and risk. Major decisions would require agreement from both or board intervention. As the meeting adjourned, Reynolds approached Marco, his expression unreadable. "Congratulations on your partial victory. It's not about winning, Mr. Reynolds," Marco replied. "It's about continuing Alexander's legacy the right way." Reynolds studied him for a moment. "We'll see what kind of legacy you leave after 3 months of actual executive responsibility. The real world has a way of challenging idealism." "Perhaps," Marco acknowledged. "Or perhaps idealism has a way of changing the real world. Time will tell which of us is right." The next morning, Marco arrived at his office to find it already occupied. An elderly security guard was carefully placing Alexander's personal items from the chairman's office onto Marco's desk. Family photographs, a collection of fountain pens, books with dozens of bookmarks protruding from their pages. "Mr. Gardner's instructions," the guard explained, "said you'd be needing a bigger office now, and his things belonged with you." The symbolism wasn't lost on Marco. Moving into Gardner's office would make a powerful statement about succession and authority. Exactly the kind of statement that might further antagonize Reynolds and his allies. Yet refusing Gardner's gesture would dishonor the trust placed in him. After a moment's consideration, Marco helped the guard move the items, but with a modification. "Let's put half of these in Mr. Reynolds' office," he instructed, with a note saying we both carry Mr. Gardner's legacy forward. The guard raised an eyebrow but nodded approvingly. "Diplomatic. The old man taught you well already." That small decision, sharing Gardner's symbolic mantle rather than claiming it exclusively, set the tone for Marco's approach to the co-executive arrangement. Where Reynolds expected competition, Marco offered collaboration. Where others anticipated power struggles, he sought consensus. The strategy initially confused Reynolds, who seemed prepared for direct confrontation rather than cooperative leadership. "I don't understand your game, Alvarez," he remarked after a particularly productive budget meeting. "What are you really after?" "The same thing you are," Marco replied honestly. "The best future for this company." Reynolds studied him skeptically. "Perhaps, but we have very different ideas about what best means." "Then let's test them both," Marco suggested. "Real results, not just theoretical arguments." This pragmatic challenge resonated with Reynolds, whose competitive nature couldn't resist the opportunity to prove his approach superior. They established metrics for success, not just financial performance, but employee satisfaction, client retention, community impact, and market reputation. As weeks passed, their unusual partnership developed an unexpected dynamic. Reynolds' financial expertise complemented Marco's people-centered approach, creating solutions neither might have developed alone. Though they often disagreed, sometimes heatedly, both men possessed enough intellectual honesty to recognize good ideas regardless of their source. Meanwhile, Alexander Gardner's health stabilized, though he remained unable to return to daily operations. Instead, he became Marco's long-distance mentor, available for counsel by phone or during Marco's hospital visits, always pushing him to look beyond immediate challenges to longer-term implications. "How are you and Prescott getting along?" he asked during one such visit, nearly 2 months into the interim arrangement. "Very better than expected," Marco admitted. "He's brilliant, Alexander, and not as cold as he first appeared." Gardner smiled knowingly. "I never said he wasn't qualified. just that he wasn't right for the soul of this company. He adjusted himself against his pillows, wincing slightly. And the board? Are they seeing your value? Some are. Others are waiting for me to fail. Marco hesitated, then voiced the doubt that had been growing within him. Sometimes I wonder if they're right to be skeptical. This is all happening so fast and the stakes are so high. Self-doubt is the companion of responsibility, Gardner replied. The day you stop questioning your readiness is the day you become dangerous. He reached for a glass of water, his hand trembling visibly. The final board evaluation is in 3 weeks. They'll make their decision then about permanent leadership. Are you prepared? As much as I can be. Reynolds has the advantage of experience, but I've built strong relationships. The financial results are solid for both divisions. Numbers won't decide this, Marco. Vision will. Gardner's eyes, though tired, remained intense. Show them not just who you are now, but who you can become. Who you can help the company become. The conversation stayed with Marco in the days that followed, as he prepared for the board's final evaluation. He worked closely with his team to develop a comprehensive 5-year strategy that honored Gardner's legacy while embracing new opportunities in ethical finance, community development, and sustainable investment. The night before the board meeting, Marco found himself working late, refining his presentation. The office was quiet, most employees having departed hours earlier. When he finally looked up from his computer, he was startled to find Prescott Reynolds standing in his doorway, watching him. "You should go home, Alvarez. Tomorrow's a big day." Reynolds entered, looking uncharacteristically reflective. "For both of us." Marco saved his work and leaned back in his chair. "Just finishing some details. You're here late yourself." "Habit." Reynolds glanced around the office, still decorated with a mixture of Gardner's mementos and Marco's modest additions. "You know, when Alexander first brought you in, I thought it was senility, a successful businessman's eccentric final act. And now?" Marco asked, curious about this unexpected candor. Reynolds considered the question. "Now I think it was characteristic, unconventional but perceptive." He met Marco's gaze directly. "We're very different men, you and I. Different backgrounds, different approaches. But these past months have shown me that we both care deeply about this institution in our own ways." The admission surprised Marco. High praise coming from you. Not praise, observation. Reynolds moved toward the door, then paused. "Whatever happens tomorrow, you've earned your place here. Remember that." With a brief nod, he departed, leaving Marco to ponder this unexpected moment of connection with his chief rival. The board meeting the following day was comprehensive and grueling. Both Marco and Reynolds presented their visions for the company's future, followed by detailed questioning about their leadership approaches, strategic priorities, and specific decisions made during the interim period. Throughout the session, Marco felt a curious calm. Regardless of the outcome, he had given everything to this opportunity. He had honored Gardner's trust and stayed true to his own values. Whatever the board decided, he could face the result with dignity. After nearly 4 hours, the board chair announced they would deliberate privately and render their decision by day's end. Marco and Reynolds were dismissed, each returning to their respective offices to await the verdict. Marco had barely settled behind his desk when his assistant announced a visitor, Rebecca Gardner, her expression unreadable. "They've decided already?" Marco asked, surprised by the speed. "No," she replied, closing the door behind her. "But I wanted to speak with you before they do." She took a seat across from him. "My grandfather asked me to give you something." From her bag, she withdrew an envelope, handing it to Marco. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a letter handwritten in Gardner's increasingly unsteady script. "Marco, by the time you read this, the board will be deciding your future with Gardner Financial. Whatever they decide, I want you to know that you have already succeeded in the ways that matter most. When I first observed you in that parking garage, I saw someone who treated others with dignity, regardless of their status. A quality I've found rare in business but essential in true leadership. In these months since, you've confirmed my every instinct about your character and potential. Leadership isn't about titles or power. It's about creating environments where others can grow, contribute, and find meaning in their work. You understand this instinctively in ways Prescott may never grasp despite his considerable talents. If the board chooses you, lead with the same authenticity that brought you to this point. If they choose otherwise, know that your journey doesn't end here. There are many paths to meaningful impact. Either way, remember, the measure of success isn't the height you reach, but the depth of your influence on the lives you touch. With pride and confidence. Alexander. Marco read the letter twice, emotion tightening his throat. "Thank you for bringing this," he said finally, carefully folding the paper and returning it to the envelope. Rebecca studied him with the same penetrating gaze as her grandfather. "He sees something special in you, Marco. So do I." She rose to leave. "Whatever happens today, you'll always have a place in our family's story." After she departed, Marco sat quietly, the letter beside him, contemplating the journey that had brought him to this moment. From the despair of unemployment to the uncertainty of the parking attendant job, to this unexpected opportunity that had transformed his life regardless of the board's imminent decision. His phone rang, Diane, her voice carrying unusual urgency. "Marco, they're ready. The boardroom right away." The walk to the boardroom felt simultaneously endless and too brief. Outside the doors, Marco paused, took a deep breath, and entered with his head high. The board members sat in silence, their expressions carefully neutral. At the head of the table was an unexpected figure, Alexander Gardner himself, pale but present, seated in a wheelchair, but with unmistakable authority in his posture. "Alexander," Marco breathed, surprised and concerned. "Should you be here?" "Wild horses, Marco," Gardner replied with a hint of his old humor. "Some moments can't be missed." The board chair cleared her throat. "Mr. Alvarez, after extensive deliberation, the board has reached its decision regarding the permanent leadership structure of Gardner Financial Group." Marco nodded, prepared to accept whatever came next with grace. "By majority vote," she continued, "we have decided to implement a unique leadership model. Prescott Reynolds will assume the role of Chief Financial Officer and Chief Operating Officer, with expanded authority over the company's financial operations." Marco's heart sank slightly, though he maintained his composed expression. If Reynolds was being confirmed in those roles, then surely, and you, Marco Alvarez, will assume the role of Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately, with Mr. Gardner transitioning to Chairman Emeritus. The words took a moment to register. CEO, not co-executive, not assistant, not some invented intermediate position. Chief Executive Officer of Gardner Financial Group. Marco looked to Gardner, whose eyes shone with undisguised pride. Then to Reynolds, who stood in the doorway, his expression a complex mixture of disappointment and, surprisingly, respect. "The board believes," the chair continued, "that this structure leverages the complementary strengths you both have demonstrated during the interim period. Mr. Reynolds' financial acumen paired with your vision and people-centered leadership approach offers the best path forward for our company." Marco found his voice at last. "Thank you for your confidence. I accept with humility and a deep commitment to honoring this company's legacy while building its future." The formalities continued, announcements to be made, paperwork to be signed, transition details to be arranged. But through it all, Marco remained acutely aware of the journey that had brought him here. From helping an elderly man across an icy parking lot to leading the company that man had built over a lifetime. When the meeting concluded, Gardner gestured for Marco to wheel him out. In the privacy of the hallway, the old man reached for Marco's hand. "I told you that day in the parking garage," he said softly. "Life parks us exactly where we need to be, even when we think we've taken a wrong turn." Marco nodded, emotion making speech difficult. "I never imagined. Few great things begin with imagination," Gardner replied. "Most start with simple acts of decency, performed without expectation of reward." His eyes, bright with unshed tears, held Marco's gaze. "You helped an old man walk safely across an icy lot. Now you'll help thousands find their way to better futures." 6 months later, Marco stood at the podium of the company's annual leadership conference, looking out at hundreds of employees gathered to hear from their still new CEO. The transition had not been without challenges. Some executives had departed, unable to accept his leadership. Market analysts had initially questioned his qualifications. Competitors had attempted to exploit the perceived inexperience. Yet the company had not merely survived but thrived. Reynolds, to everyone's surprise, had become a loyal deputy, his financial brilliance complementing Marco's vision. Together, they had launched new initiatives in community banking, ethical investment, and financial education that were already showing promising results. "When I joined this company," Marco began, his voice carrying clearly through the auditorium, "I came from an unusual background. Many of you know the story, how Alexander Gardner discovered me not in a rival firm or prestigious business school, but in the parking garage downstairs." Gentle laughter rippled through the audience. That story matters not because it's unusual, but because it embodies the principles that make this company special. Alexander saw potential where others might not have looked. He valued character alongside competence. He understood that leadership isn't about where you've been, but where you can take others. Marco gestured to the side of the stage where Gardner sat in his wheelchair, thinner now but still commanding in presence. Alexander taught me that business at its best is about more than profit. It's about creating environments where people can grow, contribute, and find meaning in their work. It's about seeing opportunities to make lives better through the decisions we make every day. He paused, looking out at the faces before him, executives and entry-level employees, veterans and new hires, all united by their connection to this institution. As we move forward together, that vision will guide everything we do. We will measure our success not just by the returns we generate, but by the lives we improve. Not just by the wealth we create, but by how widely and wisely that wealth is shared. In the audience, Marco spotted familiar faces, his mother and sister beaming with pride, James Chen, his early ally now leading an expanded community investment division, Diane, still indispensable, managing both his office and Gardner's reduced but continuing involvement. I stand before you today not as someone who has all the answers, but as someone committed to asking the right questions. Not as a finished product, but as a work in progress. Just like this company, just like all of us. He looked again at Gardner, drawing strength from the old man's approving gaze. Life sometimes parks us in unexpected places. The question is whether we have the courage to step out of our comfort zones when opportunity calls, to offer a hand to those who need it, to accept help when it's offered, to believe that small acts of kindness can lead to extraordinary journeys. As Marco concluded his address, the audience rose in a standing ovation. But amid the applause, his attention remained fixed on Alexander Gardner, whose simple decision to notice a parking attendant's daily kindness had changed not only 2 lives, but potentially thousands more through the company they both now serve. In that moment, Marco understood with perfect clarity what Gardner had been teaching him all along. True leadership begins not with ambition or authority, but with seeing the humanity in others and honoring it through our actions. The rest, titles, responsibilities, impact, flows from that essential foundation. The parking attendant who had helped an elderly man daily, not knowing he was scouting for his company's new CEO, had found his own path to leadership. Not through calculation or credential, but through the simple, profound power of kindness offered without expectation of reward.